Hi, I'm Jenny from A Living Bread Baker, and I want to tell you of how to travel with your sourdough starter, whether you're taking a road trip or whether you're flying. So first of all, when you're taking a trip, you have to evaluate whether you're going to have time or you will have the space to actually use your sourdough starter, because, why take the effort if you won't be able to use it or won't have the time to cook with it? Personally, I love taking my sourdough starter because I know that when I go out with my family, we're a family of 6, gonna be a family of 7 in a few months, and even just for going to the coffee shop and getting a breakfast, it costs $30 for our family. If we go to dinner, it's gonna cost $60 to $80 just for a basic dinner for our family. So taking your sourdough starter with you on a trip not only allows you to save money, it also helps you to have more digestible foods that your body is used to. Because when you're traveling, that is a lot. When you're traveling and eating different foods and have a different schedule, you're more likely to have stomach issues or not feel good. So it's best to eat foods that your body is used to. Before you travel, whether you travel with your sourdough starter or leave it at home, the very first step that you need to take is you need to make sure that you take care of your starter before you leave. So take some of your starter, you are going to refresh it. I'm gonna link a video here that tells you about the refreshing process. It's not just feeding your starter, it's taking one little portion of your old batch and then feeding it with fresh flour and water. I let this become active at room temperature. Once it's active, after about 12 hours or so, usually it just takes 6 to 12 hours to become active. You can let it sit longer if you need to. You're going to take this recently refreshed batch and put it into your fridge. Put it in the coldest part of your fridge or top shelf so it stays safe while you're gone. And if you choose to travel with sourdough starter, like I'm going to show you in this video, then if something happens or if you don't have the bandwidth to repack your sourdough starter and re-prepare it for travel, you know that you have a safe, healthy starter waiting for you at home. So for a car trip, it's a little bit easier. You're going to take a jar of, it can even be a jar of discard, or take a small batch of your recently refreshed starter, about a tablespoon, and put it in a clean jar, a second jar. If you have a second jar with a tablespoon of your refreshed starter, that will be great, because if it's really active, there's room for it to expand. It won't overexpand while you're traveling. If you have a jar of discard, a lot of that vigorous activity is done. It's not going to overexpand as you travel, but I do recommend keeping it cool. So I'm going to put mine in a cooler to make sure that there's not a lot of activity while I'm driving. When you arrive at your destination with your starter, if you don't plan to do anything with it yet or don't have time, first thing is put it in a fridge or cold place. And then when you have time, it's time to either refresh your starter, feed it. If you have that tablespoon of starter, you're going to feed that and let it sit out at room temperature to become active, so that the next day or after 6 to 12 hours, you're ready to use it. Or if you have discard, like you see in this video, I'm actually going to use this to make my first recipe. So the next day, after we've gotten settled in our accommodations, I'm using this to make a batch of dumplings for making chicken dumplings for dinner. So you can see the process of me mixing with this discard here, and that link is going to be in a separate video that you can see later. But this allows us to eat at home in our own space, save money, eat something healthier, and also for the kids, it's much better than going out to a restaurant when they're already tired at the end of the day. And so after I've used my discard that I brought with me on my trip, I'm going to take that remainder and feed it again. And then by that evening, I now have active starter that I'll be using to make my favorite sourdough pancakes. And the link for that recipe is going to be linked below, because that's a wonderful recipe for making a big batch of sourdough pancakes. So when you're traveling, I find that discard recipes are some of the easiest ones to use. See the full link about how I travel with sourdough starter to see my recommendations, because there are some things you want to take into account. Whether you are able to make bread or make discard recipes, you want to know what the tools you have access to. There might be some tools that I recommend that are going to be helpful for you that you might want to bring along. But you definitely have to be flexible when you get to your space, because they might not have the cookware that you're ready to use, so you have to be adaptable. And then if there's something that's non-negotiable, make sure that you pack it. Okay, now for how you fly with sourdough starter. I have done this several times. I've even taken sourdough starter from California to the UK. So I've done this on the way there, and I did it on the way back. So I've done this on full-length flights, and I've never had a problem, so I'm going to tell you how I do it. So the first thing is that you're going to take a small bowl and add to it a tablespoon of your starter. The tablespoon you add can be an active starter, or it can be a liquid state of a sourdough starter discard. Just know that whatever state that your starter is in, it will affect how much flour it's going to absorb in this next step. Now that you've added your tablespoon of starter to the bowl. Then it's time to add 1 tablespoon of white flour. I'm using an all-purpose flour here. Take your spoon and mix this together. Start mixing this together. Once it gets really hard to mix, you want to get in there with your hands and start mixing it. And you want to add a little bit more flour if it's too sticky. I usually have to add a little bit pinch more to make sure that it becomes a soft dough that's dry. So once you've mixed it thoroughly, it becomes this dry lump of dough. You're gonna take your dry lump of dough and put it in this strong Ziploc bag. I'm using a gallon-sized freezer bag. Freezer bags have a little bit thicker plastic, are a little bit more strong and durable for longer trips. So put that in there, make sure it's sealed well. If you plan to put in your checked baggage, I would double seal it just to make sure it doesn't leak on your clothes. For me, I'm going to just take this and I'm putting it directly into my backpack. This can be prepared right before you head out the door for your flight, or if you want to do this the night before, I recommend putting it in the fridge or on an ice pack overnight before you pack your carry-on. Keeping it in a cold space before you travel will help keep the activity minimal so it doesn't overexpand before you even get on the plane. And this is really important to make sure it has enough life and has enough food for your trip. One helpful tip is if you don't want to forget your sourdough starter the next morning, if you have an early flight, put an ice pack with your sourdough starter right next to your car keys so there's no way that you will forget it. All right, so our sourdough starter is put into our carry-on bag, or you've packed it into your checked baggage. For my carry-on bag, I've never had a problem with TSA. I labeled it for this trip, live sourdough starter. I haven't labeled it in previous trips. I've never had a problem with it, but if they do want to inspect it, they should be able to do a swab to make sure it's a safe substance. And make sure this is in a cold spot. Usually if I put my bag on the floor of the airplane is really cold and allows that starter to stay even colder, which is more important if you're taking an international flight like I have done. For shorter domestic flights, keeping it extra cold shouldn't be a problem. The activity builds so slowly because you have a stiff, dry lump of sourdough starter, meaning that it has a ton of food, and so the activity builds very slowly. It's different than having a more wet starter. Once you arrive at your destination, you'll take your sourdough starter out. You'll notice there's some bubbles in it. You'll see that thick texture from the activity that's formed even just over the course of a few hours. The starter that you see here was actually sitting in my backpack for about over 12 hours before I actually got to it. So you see, even over 12 hours, this stayed clean and it didn't create a mess for me to clean up when I got to my destination. So the first step to reactivate your sourdough starter is you're gonna take a bowl cup. I'm using a mug here. The AirBNB we had for this trip wasn't as well equipped in the kitchen, so I had to get a little bit creative. So to your coffee mug or your bowl, or if you have a jar on hand at your destination, you'll take 1 tablespoon of your sourdough starter that was taken with you on your flight, put that in your container, and then you're going to start with 2 tablespoons of water and 2 tablespoons of flour. And mix this together. And then I had to add, for mine, because it's a little more dry, I added 1 more tablespoon of water to get back to that regular consistency that we like to see when we're refreshing a 100% hydration sourdough starter. So mix these portions together until you see your starter becoming fully incorporated with the flour and the water and forming this thick milkshake texture. So cover this well, let it sit for 8 to 14 hours. Mine sat for 12 hours before it started to show the activity I would like to see. And at that point, it's ready to use in different recipes. This does create a smaller batch when you're just getting started for your trip, so you can expand it. You will increase those tablespoons of water to flour. So if you want a bigger batch, that's more akin to what you would use for 1 batch of bread, about 100 grams of sourdough starter, then you would need to feed it a little bit more. So the instructions for that are linked in the full post for how to travel with your sourdough starter if you'd like to do that. But one more step that you're seeing here is I want to make my travel starter work for me the next morning. So I'm gonna make my sourdough pancakes with this starter, but the process is just a little bit different than what you might have seen in my sourdough pancake recipe video. So for this, I'm still gonna make my overnight sponge, my pre-ferment, but instead of having 200 grams of discard, I'm just gonna use 1 tablespoon of the starter that I brought with me on the trip. So that 1 tablespoon, it's basically the last tablespoon in my bag, goes into my mixing bowl, and then I'm going to feed that with my 650 grams of water and 500 grams of all-purpose flour. A tip for this is that I would use warmer water In my regular sourdough pancakes recipe is not a needed step because all that discard, the ratio of how much we've added, allows the activity to build in the right time frame to be ready for breakfast. Whereas we are only starting with that 1 little tablespoon of sourdough starter here. So the warm water and keeping it in a warm place, I put this next to the space heater in our AirBNB, that allowed it to create the activity that was right and nice and bubbly for the next morning for me to make pancakes. So I'm showing you a little bit of the steps of how I make pancakes. You can see I had to get really creative making pancakes in our destination. If they didn't have a griddle, a lot of the pans were scratched, non-stick cookware, which isn't really safe to use. So I was using a pot that looked okay. I was using parchment paper on a cookie sheet, and I was using a waffle iron to make a variety of pancakes. But the bottom line is that my goal of trying to save money for my family and create a healthier meal for us was accomplished by making this simple recipe. And for traveling back home with your sourdough starter, if you don't plan to leave it there, I think the way that I've traveled with the sourdough starter by plane is really easy because I usually just leave it there because I've had my sourdough starter safe at home in my fridge and I don't have the hassle of recreating that process. But if you choose to, you can do that steps again where you take your tablespoon of starter and mix it with flour to make a dry lump of dough. But I hope that was helpful for you. I love traveling with my sourdough starter, and I would also love to hear from you. If you have a way that you use your sourdough starter for camping, it's really fun for using on the road at your friend's house, family house, or if you even travel by airplane. Let me know what you've made as you've been visiting friends or family or taking a trip with your sourdough starter. Let me know if you plan to try this. If you've tried other things, I would love to hear from you in the comments section. Please share this video with someone, maybe someone who's taking a trip with you or someone you know who's taking a trip soon. And if you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe for more sourdough help, and I hope that you keep connecting with people whether you're at home or traveling to somewhere fun soon. All right, bye.